Chapter 20 Continuation of the War 1824. Major Chisholm's orders from the governor had been to remain in camp with his troops at Ampensarsu until he received further instructions. But, as has been seen, the letter telling him to advance, though sent off on the 17th of January, was not delivered until the 22nd. In fact, a second urgent summons that had been sent off during the battle on the 21st actually reached him 2 hours before it. While he had been awaiting the arrival of these orders, he had heard that a strong party of the enemy was somewhere in the neighborhood of his camp, and sent Mr. Henry Barnes out with a small scouting party to obtain definite information of its movements. After some hours had been spent in the search, this party heard the confused hum of a multitude near at hand, and climbed to the top of some rocks overhanging the prah, where they concealed themselves among the bushes and plainly saw a force of about 2,000 Ashantis encamped on the other side of the river. The enemy's position was so unprotected, and they were so evidently unsuspicious of any danger, that the party, instead of returning to report to Major Chisholm and enable him to surround and surprise the Ashantis, instead fired 3 volleys into their midst, and then, standing up to show their redcoats on the brow of the hill, gave a loud cheer. This struck consternation into the enemy, who immediately deserted their camp, leaving all their baggage and many valuables behind them, and retreated as quickly as possible along the river bank to rejoin the main body of their army. It was this force that had arrived during the battle of Insamankow, and taking Sir Charles's force in the rear, cut off its retreat. Had Major Chisholm been kept informed of the position and movements of the several divisions of the Ashanti army by a well-organized system of native scouts, he might have routed and pursued this force, and, by pressing them hard now that they were panic-stricken, have kept them in full flight until they reached Insamankow, where their disorderly arrival would have greatly confused the Ashantis engaged there, and they themselves would have been hemmed in between 2 British fires. On the arrival of the letters on the 22nd, Major Chisholm hastened to join the governor, and, fearing the delay that had already occurred might seriously interfere with his plans, elected to go by the shortest route, which, however, lay over a very bad road and necessitated crossing the prah within 5 miles of Ampensarsu. Only 1 canoe was available, and the whole of the 23rd was occupied in ferrying the troops and stores across the river. It was while he was thus detained on the banks of the prah that the first news reached him that an engagement had taken place, but it was not until he fell in with Captain Ricketts the next day that he heard the result and learned of the disaster that had overtaken Sir Charles Macarthy's force. Feeling that he could no longer be of any assistance to the governor, and knowing that his force alone could never hope to withstand the advance of the victorious Ashanti army, Major Chisholm decided to return by forced marches to defend Cape Coast, against which the enemy were believed to be rapidly advancing. He left on the 25th. Captain Ricketts, who was still unable to walk, being carried in a basket palanquin on the heads of some of the native soldiers. They had been scarcely an hour on the road when Captain Lestrange of the Royal African Corps, who was with the advance guard, dropped dead from exposure and fatigue. That night was spent in a deserted village. Efutu was reached early on the following afternoon, and Cape Coast late the same evening. Here they found Captain Lang, who, in accordance with his instructions, had advanced about 13 miles from his camp at Yankumasi Fanti in the direction of Asin, but had heard then of the defeat of the governor from a messenger sent him by the officer commanding at Cape Coast, who, in turn, had had the news from some wounded stragglers from the battle who had reached Secondi and came on from there by canoe. He had then deemed it prudent to return, and succeeded in bringing his whole force in safety to Cape Coast. The expectations of an immediate attack on the town were not realized. The Ashantis remained for some time at Insamankau. In fact, an Ashanti army seldom derives the full benefit of such a victory by immediately following up its advantage, but remains encamped in the neighborhood, pillaging and burning the villages and destroying the plantations and farms, and when it does finally renew its advance, it generally proceeds at a very leisurely pace. In the meantime, the inhabitants of Dutch Secondi had been committing some outrages against the English. Captain Woolcombe of HMS Glendower and 2 of his officers had landed there on the 25th of January to see the place and try to gain some reliable news of the battle which they understood had taken place, and had been attacked. The people had pursued them with drawn knives and compelled them to run to their boat, but on reaching his ship, Captain Woolcombe had immediately fallen in a party of marines and returned, intending to administer a warning against any repetition of such conduct that would not soon be forgotten. Much to his surprise, the Secondis had mustered in full strength on the beach and prepared to oppose the landing of his men, who had to embark under a heavy fire, which, however, they amply returned. The marines then advanced into the town and drove the people into the bush beyond. 2 marines and a crew boy were killed and several others wounded in this encounter. But all attempts to destroy the town had failed, as the thatch was too wet to burn. The Secondis, moreover, had brutally murdered several wounded fugitives who had fled to their town after the battle of Insamankau, and Major Chisholm now determined to punish them for these acts. On the 5th of February, Captain Lang was sent to Jukwa with a detachment of the Royal African Colonial Corps and a few Anamabos and other Fantis, who brought up the total strength of his force to about 400 men. By the 14th, nearly 1,000 men had been collected, and orders were then sent to move to Comenda, where Major Chisholm joined him the next day. Here the embarkation of the whole force on board HMS Swinger and HMS Glendower was commenced at daybreak on the 16th and completed by sunset, when HMS Ban also arrived. The 3 ships then left for Secondi, which they hoped to reach the same night, and so surprise and capture about 400 Ashantis who were known to be in the town. But they had both wind and current against them, and it was 3 o'clock the next afternoon before they anchored off it. The troops were at once disembarked, but the Ashantis and Secondis had already fled. The town, however, was set on fire, and by 8 o'clock that evening the whole place had been completely destroyed, everything in it having been either burned or blown up, and the troops returned the same night to Cape Coast. In the meantime, Osei Tutu Kwamina had died in Kumasi, having passed away on the 21st of January, on the very same day as Sir Charles McCarthy had lost his life. This king, who was probably the finest man who ever sat on the Ashanti stool, might well be named the Misunderstood. All that is known of him, and it is a great deal, for several Europeans came in close contact with him and knew him personally, tends to show that he was a man of high character, honourable in his dealings, peaceable in his disposition, and forbearing with his enemies, a man of sound sense, and one who regarded his plighted word as sacred and did not make vain promises, but who expected to find the same characteristics in others, especially those whom he acknowledged to be his superiors, and to receive what were his just dues. Colonel Terrain, who with all his faults was certainly an able man, wrote of him, "In all my negotiations with the king, I had cause to remark what I have not experienced on the sea coast, to wit, the strictest regard to his word. In fact, I look on King Zay, so he is called, to be a high character." Mr. James Swansea, again, said of him, "I think, of all the native sovereigns of Africa that I have ever read or heard of, he is the man most likely to act with good faith." No one can read the various accounts of the history of these times without feeling some pity for the keen disappointment this king must have felt, and a sense of shame that he should have been so much misunderstood and so unfairly treated. Savage he was, and as might therefore be expected, some of his demands may have seemed unreasonable in the eyes of more civilized people, but that his intentions were honorable there can be little doubt, and it is equally certain that if at any time he made excessive demands, he was always willing to listen to reason, and being a just man himself, was ready to modify or abandon any extortionate or groundless claim if proper cause were shown. The African, in any case, habitually asks for more than he expects or even wishes to receive, and this is so well known a trait in his character that the first thing done is to ask for a reduction, and, were it not given, the original demand would, on that ground alone, be considered extortionate and absurd. Osei Tutu Quamina is of all the Ashanti monarchs the one on whom the Englishman should look with the most interest, for he was the first of the line who came into contact with Europeans, and by observing the attitude which he adopted towards them before the occurrence of those hostilities by which the relations of the two powers were subsequently embittered, we may learn what was the position that the Ashantis would have spontaneously adopted towards the white men. The history of this king's reign affords much food for both reflection and regret. The English companies who held the forts and settlements along the seaboard were, as has been shown, merely the tenants of the coast tribes, and had no interest in the country beyond trade. When these tribes came into collision with the Ashantis, the English, as a third party, having no concern with the quarrels of the people, were at first inclined to remain neutral. Had they done so, it is unlikely that they would have suffered any harm at the hands of the Ashantis, who always declared that they had no quarrel with the whites, and had no wish to make war on them. The real object of their invasions, apart from the extension of their empire and the punishment of wrongs and insults, was to gain free access to the trading settlements on the coast, and thus avoid the profits of the fancy middlemen brokers, and the risk of having the market closed to them at inconvenient moments. The English, therefore, were not likely to be molested, and it was not until they received fugitives into Anamabo Fort and opened fire on the Ashanti army that they definitely abandoned their neutrality and declared for the Fantis. No reasonable person can doubt the originally friendly intentions of Tutu Kwamina, and putting altogether on one side the question of what may or may not have been a wise policy in later years, it is certainly very doubtful if it was wise at this time for a company with very limited resources both in money and men, openly to espouse the cause of a weak and practically conquered race, and by doing so, to place itself in antagonism to a powerful nation whose military prowess was a byword, and from or through whom the greater part of its trade came. With no standing army and no one but the none no one but the none too valorous Fantis to whom they could look for assistance, this mere handful of men could never aspire to the subjugation of Ashanti, and it would certainly have been more to their own interest, and that of the country generally, if they had kept the treaty they made, or hastened to come to a fresh understanding with this people as a recognized power when they were given the opportunity after the first treaty had been broken. A passive neutrality would have been difficult to maintain unless their position had been clearly defined. Unfortunately, as has been seen, this was not the course followed, and the arrival of the ill-fated Sir Charles McCarthy, who rashly concluded that the position was hopeless and greatly underrated the power of Ashanti, inaugurated what has been an almost continual policy of hostility to that kingdom. With the unerring instinct of a professedly philanthropic nation, they, the English, have selected the sturdiest, most enterprising, and most courageous tribe as the special object of their hostility, and have consistently endeavored, after the fashion too common among philanthropists, to secure in the most perfect manner the survival of the unfittest. Tutu Kwamina was succeeded by his youngest brother, Osai Yao, usually known as Okutu, Orange, from the light color of his skin. It was indeed fortunate that the Ashantis had remained quiescent after the battle of Insamankau, for this defeat and the death of the governor caused such a revulsion of feeling and such keen disappointment amongst the Fantis, that it would have been almost impossible to raise another force at this time. Many of the chiefs, indeed, bitterly repented their hurried repudiation of the Ashanti alliance, and sincerely regretted that they had ever been induced to identify their interests with those of the English, for they believed they had now lost everything, and that the vengeance of Ashanti must soon overtake them, and some time had to elapse before they began to recover themselves. The Ashantis were still encamped at Insamankau, but towards the end of February it was reported in Cape Coast that they were actively preparing to renew the campaign and intended to start for the coast on the 1st of March. Their actual numbers were now given as 15,000, and, as it was not deemed prudent to risk an engagement with any force that the English could now put on the field, it was decided to offer no opposition to their advance until they reached the Pra, and then to dispute the passage of the river and make a last determined effort to protect the actual settlements from attack. The Accra militia under Captains Hanson and Bannerman were now ordered to join Captain Lang at Commander, whose force was thus brought up to about 6,000 men. But no sooner had this junction been effected than Captain Lang was taken ill and had to be invalided to England, and Captain Ricketts, himself far from well, was sent to take over his command. A detachment of the 2nd West India Regiment was now stationed at Derabourassi, and other small bodies of troops were sent to occupy Heman and the other villages through which it was thought the Ashantis might advance. It was believed, however, that they would attempt to cross the Pra somewhere in the neighbourhood of Shama, and the main body of the British force was therefore moved to the mouth of the river, where a large camp was formed. The troops presented a formidable appearance when drawn up in line, and were distinctly visible from Dutch Secondi, where a small detachment of the enemy was again quartered. But though several skirmishes took place between these troops and scattered parties of the enemy across the river, the expected general advance did not take place. The strength of the force had now been increased to 8,000, and the men began to chafe at the enforced inactivity and delay, and their impatience was further increased by the growing scarcity of provisions. The chiefs therefore informed Captain Ricketts that they wished to cross the river and attack the enemy at once, saying that their men would lose their courage if they remained idle any longer. It does not seem to have occurred to them, however, that their courage might evaporate even more quickly when they found themselves face to face with an Ashanti army. The chiefs were told that the object of the encampment was not to attack the enemy, but to dispute his passage of the river and protect the country beyond it. But they continued their importunities, and were at length informed that an advance could only be made if they provided carriers for ammunition, which they had hitherto neglected to do. Affairs were in this condition when, on the 10th of March, Captain Ricketts was recalled to Cape Coast, owing to the illness of Major Chisholm, and the command of the army on the Pra devolved upon Captain Blenkiron. A few days later, Governor Last, who had but recently arrived on the coast from Holland, wrote to inform Major Chisholm of the arrival of some Ashanti messengers at Elmina, who had asked that a British officer might come over and hold a palaver with them. Captain Ricketts accordingly went to Elmina, where he met the messengers and the Ashanti resident at Giampon at a meeting in the castle. When called upon by Governor Last to state their business, these messengers said that their master, the King of Ashanti, had not sent his army with any intention of waging war on the white men, but in order to capture and bring to Kumasi Kujo Chibu, the king of Denkera, Arusuku, the chief of Shiforo or Tufel, and Enimil, the king of western Wasau, who had revolted and taken up arms against him, their sovereign. That if these free men were now given up, the Ashanti army would at once retire, but that the orders of the king, in the case of Kujo Chibu especially, were peremptory, and they had instructions to take him at all hazards, even if he should seek an asylum within the castle at Cape Coast. This demand was the direct outcome of the precedent set by Colonel Terrain, and the cause of this special animosity against the king of Denkera makes it likely that the king's assertion that his army had been sent against him and not against the English may have been quite true. Some time before the war broke out, Kujo Chibu had been ordered to appear at Kumasi, but accounts differ as to the exact reason for this summons. He appears, however, to have given the king reason to believe that he was meditating a rebellion, and was detained for some time in the capital, but was privately informed that he would be put to death and determined to escape. He therefore spent the greater part of the night in singing and dancing, and then, ordering the drummers to continue playing till daybreak, stole quietly away with 30 of his followers, and soon afterwards joined a strong force of his own people and the Wassals. He then openly declared war against Ashanti, and some Ashantis who were mining gold in Denkara were sent to Kumasi to convey a defiant message to the king and inform him that his captains were not very trustworthy persons, seeing that he had been able to bribe them to let him escape. This charge, of course, created a great stir in the capital, all the chiefs swearing on the king's head that the accusation was false, and vowing that they would bring Chibu back to prove his words. Dai Kra had then sent out with a large army to capture him, and it was this army, which was already driving the Denkaras before it, that had met and defeated Sir Charles McCarthy at Insamankau. The Ashanti messengers also positively denied that the king had ever issued any orders for the execution of the sergeant who had been seized at Anamabo, but asserted that the Fantis at Dunkwa had committed the act on their own initiative. This, of course, was quite untrue, though if, as was rumoured, Tutuquamina pardoned the man and his chiefs afterwards took the law into their own hands, it does not necessarily follow, nor is it indeed likely, that he would have been informed of it, and the account Akutu now gave may have been the one given to him. The reply given by Captain Ricketts to these messengers was unfortunately rather ambiguous. He said that the English had not come to the Gold Coast to make war against the natives, but rather to befriend them, and in proof of his words instanced the abolition of the slave trade, adding that if properly accredited messengers were sent down for the purpose, there need be no difficulty in concluding a peace at Elmina if the Ashantis so desired. It is a pity that he did not at once make it clear that the treacherous precedent set by Colonel Touraine would in no case be followed, for there is no doubt that the absence of any specific allusion to this definite demand led the Ashantis to infer that no objections would be raised on that score, and caused others also to fall into the same error. It was finally agreed that, pending the arrival of ambassadors with full powers to conclude a peace, the British troops would make no further attack on the Ashantis, and that they would in turn remain where they then were and not molest the Allies. Orders to this effect were issued to the troops on the 16th of March. After this meeting was over, Governor Last suggested to the Ashantis that in order to prove the sincerity of their proposals for peace, they should release the colonial secretary, Mr. Williams, who was still a prisoner in their camp, and this they finally consented to do, provided they were allowed to hand him over to the Dutch governor, and he gave an understanding that he should not go to Cape Coast, nor to any other place except Holland. He was brought from Shama by canoe a few days later, and after being marched in triumph through the streets of Elmina, stark naked and with his hands tied behind his back, was handed over to Governor Last. In the meantime, Captain Blenkiron, who was still encamped near the mouth of the Pra, had been supplied by the chiefs with carriers for the ammunition, and had already fixed a day for crossing the river and attacking the enemy, when he was informed of the amnesty and had to countermand his orders. This sudden determination not to molest the Ashantis, combined with the vague reply given by Captain Ricketts at the conference at Elmina, which was, of course, well known to and had been freely discussed by chiefs, led them to fear that the government contemplated purchasing a peace at the price of their surrender, and it must be admitted that, with the recollection of Colonel Terrain's proceedings before them, and the very indefinite nature of Captain Ricketts' remarks, it was perhaps only natural that they should have entertained this idea. Kujochibu and the other chiefs, therefore, conceiving that if they wished to avoid being delivered into the hands of their enemies, they must rely upon their own efforts, determined to attack the Ashantis at once, and in spite of all Captain Blenheim could do to dissuade them, crossed the Pra on the morning of the 24th of March, and began cutting a series of paths through the bush towards the enemy's position, leaving him with only the regulars, some militia, and a small body of Akras, who altogether amounted to barely 600 men. When Major Chisholm heard of their proceedings and of the misunderstanding that had arisen, he sent Captain Hutchinson of the Anamabo militia to explain the whole matter to them and assure them that the English would never consent to give them up in order to conclude peace, nor for any other reason. But he failed to convince them, and they steadily persisted in their preparations for attacking the Ashantis. It was, of course, impossible that the movements of such a large body of men could long escape the notice of the Ashantis, who naturally regarded this breach of the amnesty that had been arranged at Elmina as but another example of the small amount of reliance that could be placed on British promises, and at once made a counter-move by marching a strong force from Insamankau to the bank of the Pra opposite Deraboasi, where they too threatened to cross. Captain Blenheim therefore moved the men he still had with him to Deraboasi to watch the movements of this force and oppose any further attempt to advance. The Ashantis were unusually well supplied with ammunition, for all that had been lost on the road to Insamankau had of course fallen into their hands. A great deal of sniping therefore went on across the river, while small skirmishes were of almost daily occurrence. An ensign Erskine of the Royal African Colonial Corps, amongst others, was disabled by a bullet which entered his thigh one morning while he was sitting in a hut by the river bank. After more than a week of arduous toil, the Allies at last succeeded in carrying their paths to within easy reach of the Ashanti position, and by the 9th day they were ready to attack it. But now that the crucial moment had arrived, their courage failed them, and the Wassals fled incontinently to the river under cover of night and recrossed it. Their desertion was soon discovered, and Appiah sent word of what had happened to the other allies along the line and advised them to postpone the attack, which had been arranged for the following morning, until a little later. The news, however, struck panic into them all, and a headlong flight into the Pra immediately ensued. In their frantic haste to recross it, many men were drowned, and over 2,000 guns and nearly all the ammunition were lost. The panic-stricken and hungry survivors of this disgraceful flight, who in spite of the darkness and confusion had succeeded in reaching the eastern bank, at once separated and made their way to their own homes, and the native force then and there ceased to exist. Captain Blenheim, who was thus left with only a handful of half-starved men, believed that the Ashantis, who had heard the noise made by the Allies in their midnight stampede, were preparing to advance and pursue them, and decided to retire. Accordingly, on the 2nd of April, he retreated through Efutu to Cape Coast with his main body, while a smaller detachment fell back on Commander, whence it was hurriedly conveyed to headquarters by HMS Swinger and the Sierra Leone packet, as the Ashantis were believed to be close behind them. During his march, Captain Blenheim fell in with Kujo Chibu and a few Denkeras at Bensu, but it was only after he had repeatedly given him the most solemn assurances that he would on no account be surrendered to the enemy that he finally succeeded in overcoming his distrust of the English and induced him to accompany him to Cape Coast. The Ashantis, however, never made any attempt to pursue the Allies, but contented themselves with encamping on the ground they had vacated. On the 10th of April, Major Chisholm ordered Captain Blenheim to move his men to Efutu and form another camp there, while Kujo Chibu and Apia, who had in the meantime rallied many of their people, were sent to occupy Dompim. The Ashantis were drawing their water from a small stream flowing near the latter place, and the two chiefs determined to prevent this and opened fire on some of them as they came down. The Ashantis at once took cover and called out from the dense bush that they would soon see who was master, and on the 25th attacked the position. The Allies fought well and seemed to be driving the enemy before them, for the center of the Ashanti line began to give way, but this was merely a ruse on their part, and as the Denkeras and Ajumakos pressed forward to follow up the advantage they thought they had gained, they suddenly wheeled in on either flank and inflicted a terrible slaughter. The survivors fled through the bush in all directions. Apia himself contrived to escape, but lost himself in the forest, where he was found many days later, crawling on his hands and knees through the undergrowth, terribly emaciated and almost dead. He was carried down to Cape Coast, but smallpox was raging there at the time, and soon afterwards claimed him as a victim. Captain Blenheim had heard the firing from his camp at Efutu and hastened to the support of the Allies, but arrived too late to be of any assistance to them, and finding that they had been routed and that the Ashantis, contrary to their habit, were preparing to follow up their victory at once and were rapidly cutting paths in the direction of Efutu, he fell back once more on Cape Coast. So rapidly, indeed, did the Ashantis advance on this occasion that they dashed into Efutu at one end as the English were leaving it at the other. Ensign Mackenzie, who only escaped capture by leaping through the window of a house, covered their retreat with a small party who killed several of the enemy before falling back to join the main body. Patrick Riley and two other privates of the Royal African Colonial Corps were the only men who failed to escape. When the order was given to retire, they had gone into a house to loot some rum that they had seen there, but before they could leave again, the Ashantis were upon them. One of the men fixed his bayonet and tried to defend himself as they broke into the house, but was instantly beheaded. Riley and the other man, however, offered no resistance and were quietly secured and soon afterwards sent to Kumasi, where one of them died about 12 months later, but Riley himself remained a prisoner in a village just outside the capital for 4 years. The Ashantis then occupied Efutu, and, a few days later, when it was found that they made no further move, the troops were again ordered out from Cape Coast and encamped in the government garden at Berula, about 5 or 6 miles from Cape Coast and 3 or 4 from Efutu. Great difficulty was found in collecting any native force to assist the regulars and militia, but eventually about 6,000 men were got together in this camp. News was now reached that Osai Okutu was advancing in person with 10,000 men to reinforce his army, and Major Chisholm decided to attack before the junction could be effected. Orders were accordingly issued for the troops to cross the Sweet River and advance against Efutu. The next few days were fully taken up by the quarrels of the Allies as to the positions they should respectively occupy, The Fantis insisted on being placed on the right of the line, but the Dankeras were strongly opposed to this, for they understood their cowardly nature only too well and knew that the sole reason for their choice was that Cape Coast lay on that side. They declared that if the Fantis were placed there, they would they would bolt as soon as the firing commenced, and wanted them to be put on the extreme left, where the proximity of the Alminas would cut off all hope of retreat, and they would have no alternative but to fight. After much heated argument, however, the Fantis finally declared that if they were not allowed to have their own way, they would go home at once without even making a pretense of fighting. So the point was reluctantly conceded to them, and the several divisions began cutting paths through the bush towards Afutu. On the 18th of May, Lieutenant Colonel Sutherland arrived at Cape Coast on board the HMS Driver to assume the government of the Gold Coast, and went out with Major Chisholm on the 19th to join the troops. They found the men still busily employed in cutting their paths, which were now nearing completion, and the governor, not wishing to deprive Major Chisholm of the credit of the attack he had planned, left him in command and returned to Cape Coast to superintend the transport of the ammunition and other supplies. On the 21st, every available man in the Cape Coast garrison was sent out to help Major Chisholm, while the castle and towers were temporarily held by marines landed from the warships in the roads. The paths had now been carried right up to the Ashanti position. The enemy were encamped on the summit of a densely wooded hill just outside of Afutu, from the foot and lower slopes of which they had cleared the bush so that they could have a clear view of the British force as it advanced and yet remain under cover themselves. The battle commenced at 1 o'clock on the afternoon of the 21st of May and lasted until dusk, but the Ashantis, though they had fought throughout with their accustomed bravery and made more than one attempt to turn the British flank, were driven back with heavy loss. Kujo Chibu and his Dankeras on the left of the line greatly distinguished themselves. In the midst of the battle, he had sent a bowl containing 6 Ashanti heads to Major Chisholm to show him what he was doing, and then, after fighting for 5 hours with extraordinary valor, followed the retreating Ashantis right into Afutu. The Fantis, as had been expected, nearly all ran away at the first at the first volley without even firing a shot, and though others remained till the end of the battle, no one seems to have been more surprised than themselves. In fact, now that the day had been won, they actually seem to have taken alarm at their own success and promptly fled. As Cruikshank says, these gallant warriors seem to have been inspired somewhat with Macbeth's fears. I am afraid to think what I have done. Look on it again, I dare not. Had the Fantis only behaved with the most ordinary courage, the Ashanti army might have been cut up altogether. But darkness was now coming on, the ammunition was almost expended, and the carriers who were coming up with further supplies and with water and provisions, meeting the Fantis in full flight towards Cape Coast, naturally thought that the English had again been beaten, were seized with panic, threw down their loads to join them. The Dankeras and a few of the Cape Coast people were now the only native auxiliaries who remained, and all the men being hungry and without water owing to the flight of the carriers, the force had to fall back on the Sweet River instead of continuing the pursuit. This retrograde movement dispirited the men and destroyed any enthusiasm they might have had for a pursuit the next morning. The troops were, therefore, were called to Cape Coast, and only a small outpost under Lieutenant Rogers of the Royal African Colonial Corps was left at Beulah to keep watch on the movements of the enemy. When this action took place, the main body of the king's army had only reached Mansu, but a few men who were in advance are said to have taken part in the engagement, and it was currently reported that the Ashantis were also reinforced by a strong detachment of Elminas. The British force consisted of 2 officers, 99 men of the 2nd West India Regiment, 3 officers, and 136 men of the Royal African Colonial Corps, 470 militia of all ranks, and 77 chiefs, with about 5,000 of the native allies. No officer was killed, but Lieutenant Hutchinson of the Anamabo militia was wounded, being shot through both wrists as he was in the act of urging on his men. The other losses were 9 killed and 20 wounded among the regulars, 83 militia killed and 54 wounded, and 84 killed and 603 wounded among the native allies, giving a total loss of 176 men killed and 678 wounded. What the losses of the Ashantis were was never ascertained, but they must have been very heavy.